Imagine waking up to find your prized ATV gone vanished without a trace, only to discover it wasn't some random thief, but the daughter of the very HOA Karen who had been tormenting you for months. She strutted around claiming she was untouchable, daring anyone to challenge her. The more I pushed for justice, the more the HOA circled their wagons, protecting her like she was royalty. But what happens when arrogance collides with the law, and untouchable pride lands someone behind bars? I had always thought moving into Willow Creek Estates would be the fresh start my family needed. After years of city chaos, my wife and I dreamed of a quieter life, one with wide open spaces, friendly neighbors, and the freedom to enjoy our property without constant noise or disruption. We found a modest but comfortable home at the edge of the community, tucked away with a little extra land that gave us breathing room. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was ours, and for the first time in years, it felt like we could finally exhale. The property itself came with something special, an old barn that I restored piece by piece, turning it into both a workshop and a safe place to store the ATV I had saved up for. That machine wasn't just a toy. It represented the hours of overtime I'd worked, the weekends sacrificed, and the determination to build something for myself after years of barely scraping by. Every time I pulled the ATV out and rode along the trails behind my property, it reminded me why we had chosen this place: peace, freedom, and the chance to live on our own terms. At first, Willow Creek delivered exactly what we hoped for. The mornings were quiet, with sunlight spilling over the rooftops and birdsong echoing through the trees. Neighbors waved as they passed by, and kids rode their bikes along the cul-de-sac. For a short while, it almost felt too good to be true. And maybe, deep down, I should have known that it was. Because where there is an HOA, peace is always fragile. It didn't take long to learn that this community was run by a small but controlling group of board members, with one woman standing out above the rest, the infamous Karen. Her real name was Margaret, but to everyone in the neighborhood, she was simply Karen, and the nickname fit her better than she would ever admit. She had perfected the art of controlling people through rules, fines, and intimidation. Whether it was a mailbox painted the wrong shade of white, a trash can left at the curb for 5 extra minutes, or a lawn cut 1 inch too short, Karen always found something to nitpick. Most people kept their heads down and complied. It was easier that way. They didn't want to rock the boat, didn't want to end up on the wrong side of her endless complaints. But my wife and I, at first, stayed clear of her path. We followed the rules, kept to ourselves, and avoided unnecessary confrontation. After all, we hadn't come here to fight battles. We came here to build a life. Still, even in those early days, I noticed something unsettling. Karen didn't just enjoy enforcing rules. She enjoyed creating fear. She strutted around the community like it was her personal kingdom, and worse, she raised her teenage daughter the exact same way. The girl Chelsea was brash, entitled, and reckless, with a smirk that suggested she believed she could get away with anything. While most kids in the neighborhood respected each other's boundaries, Chelsea treated everyone's property as if it were her playground. At first, it was small things. I'd notice footprints across the edge of my garden after she cut through our yard to reach her friends. Sometimes the gate at the side of the property would be unlatched, even though I knew I had locked it. I'd hear laughter and the sound of running footsteps late at night, catching glimpses of her slipping past the fences like she owned the place. Neighbors whispered about her mischief, but no one ever said much out loud, not when her mother sat on the HOA board, ready to defend her with every ounce of authority she had. I brushed it off in the beginning, telling myself that teenagers make mistakes and kids push boundaries. But I couldn't shake the unease. The more I saw Chelsea's smug grin and careless attitude, the more I realized she wasn't just reckless, she was emboldened by the shield her mother provided. And that shield was the HOA. Life carried on like this for a while. My wife and I tried to ignore the minor annoyances, focusing instead on the joy we found in our property. Weekends were for working in the barn, fixing up tools, tending to the yard, and riding the ATV out into the woods where no HOA member could reach me. Out there, away from the manicured lawns and gossiping neighbors. I felt like myself again, free, untouchable, but the illusion of peace was already beginning to crack. I remember one particular afternoon, warm sunlight, the smell of cut grass in the air, the sound of my ATV engine echoing off the trees. When I returned, sweaty and satisfied from a ride, I noticed Chelsea standing at the edge of my driveway, her phone in hand, snapping pictures. At first, I thought she was just being nosy, but when I asked her what she was doing, she smirked and said, "Just making sure everything's documented." Then she strutted off without another word. That moment stuck with me. It was a glimpse into the arrogance she carried, the belief that nothing could touch her because of who her mother was. And while it unsettled me, I had no idea just how far she was willing to take it. Looking back, all the signs were there. The way she lingered near the barn when she thought no one was watching. The way Karen would glare at my ATV when she drove by, as if she hated that I owned something she couldn't control. The whispers from neighbors that Chelsea had been caught trespassing before but always walked away without consequences. At the time, I still wanted to believe that keeping my head down would protect me. That if I didn't stir the pot, I could hold on to my peace. But peace, when built on the shifting sands of an HOA ruled by fear and favoritism, never lasts. What started with a few footprints and smirks was about to escalate into something much darker. Chelsea's reckless sense of entitlement wasn't just going to test my patience. It was going to test the very limits of what I believed was right and wrong. Because soon, she wasn't just going to cross my property. She was going to cross a line that couldn't be ignored, one that would shake the entire community and put the untouchable image her mother had built for her to the ultimate test, and that's where everything began to spiral. It started small, almost deceptively, so the kind of problems you could almost laugh off if you didn't think too hard about them. But that's the thing about HOA disputes, they never stay small. They build like pressure in a boiler, little by little, until one day the whole thing explodes. And in Willow Creek Estates, that explosion was being fueled by one person, Chelsea, with her mother Margaret fanning the flames from the safety of the HOA board. The first real sign of trouble came one weekend when I went out to the barn, ready for a long ride on my ATV. I pulled the door open and felt my stomach twist. The latch was bent, the padlock scratched like someone had tried to force it open. At first, I thought maybe it was a fluke, some random kids messing around, but then I noticed fresh ATV tire marks across the grass leading toward the back trails. Except here's the thing, I hadn't taken the ATV out since the weekend before. That sinking feeling in my gut hardened into certainty. Someone had been in my barn. Someone had taken my machine without permission. And I already knew who it was. I asked a few neighbors if they'd noticed anything, and the looks they gave me said everything I needed to know. They didn't want to speak on it, not when it involved Chelsea. One older neighbor muttered under his breath, "You won't get far reporting her. Her mom will cover it up like she always does." That was the first time I truly understood what I was up against, not just a bratty teenager, but a teenager with an entire HOA board acting as her shield. I tried to let it slide. I told myself I didn't have proof, and without proof, confronting her would only backfire. But then, the letters started. The first one arrived in a crisp white envelope, the HOA's logo stamped across the top. It was a violation notice apparently. The barn structure on my property wasn't in compliance with updated community guidelines. According to the letter, it needed to be painted a lighter shade to match community aesthetics within 30 days or I'd face a fine of $250. I read the notice twice, then 3 times. That barn had been there decades before most of the houses in this neighborhood were even built. And now, suddenly, it was a problem? My gut told me what my head already knew. This wasn't about the barn. This was about me. About Chelsea getting caught snooping, and Margaret flexing her HOA muscle to remind me who held the power here. I tried to reason with them. I sent back a polite letter explaining that the barn was an original structure, grandfathered in long before the HOA even existed. But the response was colder than ever. Compliance is mandatory. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines. The pressure was mounting, and Chelsea was making sure to rub it in. She strutted down the street, phone in hand, snapping pictures of my property every chance she got. I'd catch her leaning on the barn door, smirking like she was daring me to say something. And when I did, she'd laugh and say, "I'm just documenting violations." Those words, documenting violations, became her weapon of choice. It only got worse from there. One night, I came home late from work and immediately noticed something was off. The barn door wasn't fully closed, and when I stepped inside, my heart sank. The ATV was gone. Just gone. The space where it normally sat was empty, the dust on the floor disturbed by fresh tire tracks leading out the back. My chest tightened with rage and panic. That machine wasn't just property, it was my sweat, my work, my escape. I called the police, of course. A report was filed, but the officer's tone said it all. These things happen. Sometimes they turn up. He asked if I had any cameras on the property, and when I admitted I didn't, his shrug felt like a slap in the face. Without hard proof, the case was dead before it even started, but I had my suspicions. And they weren't just suspicions. The very next day, I overheard a group of teenagers laughing by the corner store. One of them said, "Did you see Chelsea tearing it up on that ATV? She nearly flipped it." My blood ran cold. I confronted Chelsea directly that afternoon. She didn't deny it. She just smirked, her phone out like always, recording me as I demanded she return what was mine. "Careful," she said sweetly. "My mom says harassment is an HOA violation." Then she walked off, leaving me fuming, powerless, and very aware that her mother's shadow loomed large over every word. When I brought the issue to the HOA, things took a sickening turn. Instead of addressing the theft, I received another letter, this one accusing me of creating a hostile environment by intimidating a minor resident. The fine? $500. They had twisted the narrative completely, turning me from victim into villain. Every step I took to defend myself, the HOA was there to shove me back down. Neighbors whispered that they supported me, but when I asked them to speak up, they looked away. No one wanted to challenge Margaret, not when she controlled everything from community parking permits to landscaping approvals, and the more I tried to fight back, the bolder Chelsea became. She rode the ATV openly now, roaring down the cul-de-sac like she owned it. The sound of my engine tearing through the neighborhood made my blood boil. I called the police again, gave them the details, begged them to do something. But Chelsea always seemed to slip away just before they arrived, as if she had been tipped off in advance. Meanwhile, the fines kept piling up. $250 for the barn, $500 for hostile conduct, another $150 for improper lawn maintenance, even though my grass was trimmed shorter than most. The harassment was systematic, designed to break me down financially and emotionally until I either complied or sold the house. And all the while, Chelsea flaunted her untouchable status, daring anyone to hold her accountable. It reached a breaking point one evening when I returned home to find deep scratches gouged into the side of my truck, keys dragged across the paint in long, deliberate lines. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't just about the ATV anymore. This was personal. This was war. I filed another police report, but once again, without cameras or eyewitnesses, it went nowhere. Margaret, of course, insisted Chelsea had nothing to do with it. Calling the accusation slanderous, the HOA doubled down, warning me that false accusations against fellow residents would not be tolerated. The fine this time? $1,000. I felt trapped, cornered in my own home. Every morning, I woke up to the fear of what new notice or fine would appear in my mailbox. Every night, I went to bed listening for the sound of footsteps outside, wondering if Chelsea would strike again. The walls were closing in, and the HOA was tightening the noose, but here's the thing about being pushed to the edge: eventually, you stop backing down. Eventually, the anger outweighs the fear. And that's where I found myself ready to fight back, no matter the cost. I installed cameras around the property, hidden but strategically placed. If Chelsea or anyone else came near my barn again, I'd have the proof the police needed. For weeks, I waited, holding my breath every time I heard an engine roar or footsteps crunching in the gravel. And then, it happened. The footage was undeniable. Chelsea, in broad daylight, strolling up to the barn, fumbling with the lock until it clicked open. Moments later, the ATV rolled out, engine revving as she tore off down the street. My heart pounded as I watched it play out on the screen. Finally proof, but even with evidence, I knew this wouldn't be easy. Margaret wasn't just going to roll over and accept defeat. No, she was going to fight, and she was going to use every ounce of HOA power to shield her daughter. What happened next would determine everything, not just whether I got my ATV back, but whether the stranglehold of the HOA could finally be broken. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every neighbor who had ever swallowed their frustration, every family who had ever paid a fine out of fear, every person who had ever felt powerless under Margaret's rule. And as the walls of silence began to crack, one question echoed louder than all the rest: what happens when the untouchable finally faces consequences? The moment of truth arrived faster than I could have ever prepared for. For weeks, I had sat on that footage, debating whether it would even matter. After all, Margaret had a reputation for twisting facts, bending rules, and burying anything that made her or Chelsea look bad. But the more I replayed the video, Chelsea breaking into my barn in broad daylight, rolling the ATV out like it was hers, the more I realized this wasn't just evidence. It was my lifeline. And so, with my heart pounding and palms sweating, I made the call. I sent the footage directly to the police department, attaching a detailed statement of everything that had led up to this moment. Unlike before, when I was left with nothing but suspicion and frustration, this time, there was no denying it. The evidence was clear, sharp, undeniable. The police moved quicker than I expected. An officer came to my door within days, confirming they had reviewed the footage and would be pursuing charges. My chest tightened with a mix of relief and disbelief. Finally, after months of being painted as the problem, someone was taking me seriously. But as satisfying as that moment was, it didn't take long for Margaret to strike back. The very next HOA meeting turned into a battlefield. I walked into the community center with a folder tucked under my arm, the USB drive containing the footage inside. Neighbors filled the rows of chairs, the usual mixture of bored expressions and nervous curiosity. At the head of the long table sat Margaret, gavel in hand, her lips pressed into a smug smile. Chelsea lounged in the back corner, scrolling on her phone, as if the whole thing were just another performance staged for her amusement. Margaret wasted no time setting the tone. She called the meeting to order, then immediately launched into a tirade about continued hostility and dangerous accusations against her daughter. She held up a stack of violation notices like a trophy, waving them in the air. "This resident has created nothing but chaos in our community," she declared, her voice booming through the speakers. "We, as an HOA, must decide how to proceed before this escalates further." The irony nearly choked me. She was trying to flip the script again, to paint me as the villain. But this time, I wasn't empty-handed. I stood, my legs shaking but my voice steady. "If we're going to talk about escalation, I said, pulling the USB drive from my folder. Then let's put all the facts on the table. A murmur rippled through the room. Margaret's eyes narrowed as I handed the drive to the meeting secretary, who plugged it into the projector. And then, in front of everyone, the board, the neighbors, and Margaret herself, the footage began to play. There was no mistaking it. The video showed Chelsea approaching my barn, fumbling with the lock, pulling the door open. Seconds later, she rolled the ATV out, climbed on, and sped away. The gasps in the room were loud, collective, undeniable. Even the neighbors who had stayed silent for months now leaned forward in shock. Chelsea's smirk vanished. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her face flushing red. Margaret, however, didn't flinch. Her smile stayed plastered in place, though her knuckles whitened around the gavel. "This is taken out of context," she said coolly, as though the evidence in front of everyone's eyes was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. My daughter was simply checking on a community safety concern. That ATV has been a nuisance and a hazard for months. The room erupted, half the neighbors whispering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. One man stood up, his voice trembling with anger. "That's theft. That's not a safety check, Margaret, that's stealing." Margaret banged the gavel, her voice rising above the noise. "Order. This is not a trial. This is an HOA meeting, and as chair, I will determine what evidence is relevant." But for the first time, her control was slipping. The neighbors weren't buying it. The whispers grew louder, more people muttering about fines they'd received, rules that had seemed unfair, times when their concerns had been ignored. It was like the video had cracked open a dam, and years of silent resentment were spilling into the room. And then came the moment that turned everything. The door to the community center swung open, and two uniformed police officers walked in. The room went dead silent. The officers moved with purpose, scanning the crowd before focusing on Chelsea. One of them spoke firmly. "Chelsea Thompson, you are under arrest for burglary and theft of property." The color drained from Margaret's face. Chelsea's phone clattered to the floor as the officers guided her forward, cuffing her hands behind her back. The sight was surreal. The girl who had spent months flaunting her untouchable status, now reduced to a wide-eyed teenager, trembling under the weight of real consequences. The room buzzed with shock. Some neighbors covered their mouths. Others muttered words like "finally" and "about time." For me, it was a cocktail of emotions: relief, vindication, but also a deep, simmering anger that it had taken so long to get here. Margaret tried to regain control, her voice rising with desperate fury. "This is outrageous. You can't just storm into a community meeting and humiliate my daughter. She's a child, for God's sake." One of the officers turned to her, his tone clipped and professional. "Ma'am, your daughter is being charged based on clear evidence. If you'd like to contest it, you can do so in court. But right now, she's coming with us." Margaret's face twisted, her carefully cultivated authority unraveling in front of everyone. For once, she had no power to stop what was happening. The gavel in her hand hung useless, her words falling flat against the reality of the situation. As Chelsea was let out, the silence in the room shifted. People who had once been too afraid to speak now began to murmur openly. A woman in the front row whispered, "She's been bullying my kids for years." A man at the back muttered, "They fined me for having the wrong color mailbox, and now look at this." The tide was turning. Margaret, once untouchable herself, now sat frozen in her chair, her empire crumbling in front of her. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in months: power. Not the kind of power Margaret had abused, but the power of truth. The power of standing your ground long enough for justice to break through. But even as the officers disappeared through the doorway with Chelsea in tow, I knew the fight wasn't over. Margaret wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. Already, her eyes burned with a promise of retaliation. She would use every ounce of HOA bureaucracy to strike back. She would twist the narrative, paint her daughter as the victim, and me as the villain once again. Yet for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what she might do next, because now the community had seen the truth with their own eyes. The facade was broken, the shield of silence shattered, and Margaret would never again wield her power without being questioned. Still, the question hung heavy in the air: if Margaret was willing to bend the rules this far, how far would she go to protect herself now that the cracks were showing? The battle wasn't finished, but the war had shifted, and as I walked out of that meeting, the echoes of the gavel still ringing in my ears, I knew one thing for certain: this was the turning point. The untouchable had finally been touched, and the fallout was only just beginning. The silence after Chelsea's arrest lingered for days, thick and uneasy. In the community, whispers replaced greetings. Neighbors who once waved politely now leaned in with hushed voices, recounting what they had seen at the meeting. The footage had shocked them, but it was the sight of police officers leading Margaret's daughter away in handcuffs that truly shattered the illusion of control the HOA president had maintained for years. For me, the hours after the meeting were a blur. I had left with a mixture of triumph and exhaustion, my nerves raw but my spirit lighter than it had been in months. Still, I knew the story wasn't over. Margaret wasn't someone who surrendered easily. She thrived on control, on bending rules and narratives until the truth bent with them. Watching her composure crack in front of everyone had been satisfying, but it also made her more dangerous. Sure enough, the very next day, an email arrived. A new violation notice, this time citing public defamation of an HOA board member as grounds for a fine. My laughter was bitter. Even after her daughter had been caught stealing, Margaret still had the audacity to weaponize HOA bylaws against me. But the cracks in her power were spreading. Neighbors who had long kept their heads down now began to speak up. One couple down the street quietly admitted that Margaret had fined them nearly $1,000 for installing the wrong style of shutters. Another neighbor confessed he had been cited 3 separate times for unsightly lawn decor, despite following the rules. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, one that, now exposed, couldn't be ignored any longer. The arrest had emboldened people. At the next HOA meeting, the crowd was larger than usual. I went in prepared for another ambush, another round of twisted accusations. Instead, I found Margaret facing a wall of discontent. Her gavel slammed, her voice barked orders, but it no longer carried the same authority. One by one, residents spoke up. A man in the second row raised his hand and demanded to know why fines were being distributed unevenly, targeting certain families while others were spared. A mother stood and shared how her teenage son had been threatened with community service hours after Margaret accused him of littering, when all he had done was drop his backpack. Even those who had once remained silent now shared their stories, their voices rising in unison. Margaret tried to dismiss them, claiming they were exaggerating or misremembering events. But it was clear she no longer had the room in her grip. The arrest of her daughter had destroyed her credibility, and the video evidence had stripped away her ability to deny what everyone had witnessed. It wasn't long before a petition began circulating, a formal request for Margaret's removal as HOA president. Signatures filled the page faster than anyone expected, and within weeks, the board had no choice but to call for a vote. On the night of the election, the atmosphere was electric. Neighbors filed into the community center, some with folded arms, others with quiet determination in their eyes. Margaret sat stiffly at the front, her daughter absent for the first time in months, still tangled in her legal troubles. Her expression was a mask, calm, cold, unyielding, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her fear. When the results were announced, the room erupted. Margaret was officially removed from her position, stripped of the authority she had wielded for so long. For a moment, she sat frozen, her face pale. Then, without a word, she gathered her things and stormed out, her heels clicking against the floor in sharp, angry beats. The relief that swept through the room was palpable. Neighbors hugged one another, some even laughed, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from their shoulders. For the first time in years, the HOA felt less like a weapon and more like what it was supposed to be, a tool for community, not control. As for Chelsea, her story was far from over. The legal system moved slowly, but the charges against her were serious. Burglary and theft carried real consequences, consequences that Margaret couldn't shield her from. Word spread quickly when the court date was announced, and though I didn't attend in person, I heard the outcome through the grapevine: probation, community service, and a criminal record that would follow her for years. It wasn't jail time, but it was justice. For once, the Untouchable had been forced to face the reality of her actions, but the victory wasn't just about Margaret and Chelsea. It was about the shift in the community itself. Neighbors who had once been isolated, afraid of speaking out, began to connect with one another. Small gatherings formed barbecues, driveway conversations, impromptu coffee meetups. Bonds that had been fractured by fear and mistrust slowly healed. The very thing Margaret had used to divide and control was now knitting people together. For me, the impact was personal. The anxiety that had weighed on me for months began to lift. I no longer flinched every time I saw a letter in my mailbox, no longer dreaded walking into meetings. I could finally focus on the life I had built, tending to my property, riding my ATV without fear of it disappearing, enjoying the peace of the land I had fought so hard to protect. Still, the scars remained. It was hard not to feel anger when I thought about how long it had taken to reach this point. How many sleepless nights, how much stress and humiliation I had endured just to defend what was rightfully mine. And it was hard not to wonder how many other neighborhoods were going through the same thing, suffering under the rule of HOA leaders who abused their power, unchecked and unquestioned. That question lingered with me, because my story wasn't just about one family or one community. It was about a system that too often gave power to the wrong people. People who saw rules not as guidelines but as weapons. People who believed they were above accountability until the truth finally dragged them down. As the weeks passed, Margaret all but disappeared from community life. Some said she had put her house up for sale, unable to face the neighbors she had once controlled. Others claimed she still lurked in the background, seething, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. But her influence was gone, her empire dismantled. Whatever bitterness she carried was hers alone to bear. The board, now led by a new president, a fair-minded man named James, began to make changes. Fines were reviewed, policies rewritten, transparency enforced. Meetings became less hostile, more collaborative. The focus shifted back to what it should have been all along: improving the community, not controlling it. And through it all, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Not just because Chelsea had been held accountable, or because Margaret had been dethroned, but because I had stood my ground. I had refused to be bullied, refused to surrender, even when it felt like the entire system was against me. That was the true victory. Looking back now, I see the story differently. It wasn't just about an ATV, or a neighbor's arrogance, or even the power of an HOA. It was about resilience. About what happens when someone decides they won't be pushed any further, when they finally draw a line and say, enough. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Because if there's one thing I learned, it's that bullies thrive on silence, on fear, on the belief that no one will dare to challenge them. But when someone does, when the truth finally sees the light, everything changes. So I'll leave you with this. What would you do if it were your home, your property, your peace under attack? Would you back down, or would you fight back even if it meant standing alone? Because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to push back for the tide to turn. And when it does, the ripple is felt far beyond one gate, one meeting, one neighborhood. It's felt in the way people reclaim their voices, their courage, and their freedom, and that, more than anything, is the legacy of this fight. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.